Yeah, perfect. So thanks so much for coming. As Stephanie said, we are starting our new presentation series called Asking for a Friend. And as we get started today, we just want to go over Project Safe and who we are. So first, I want to start with our mission is that we're working to end domestic violence through crisis intervention, ongoing support, systems change advocacy, and prevention and education in the community. So we obviously have a few things here, but just to, like today, we're working on the education part. And so we provide services to Clark, Madison, Oconee, and Oglethorpe counties. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. And so we want to know you to know that we serve anyone who is a victim of domestic violence. So this includes men, women, and children. And we also just want you to know that there's no typical client of Project Safe, but anybody who has experienced a violent relationship. So this could have been physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. But yeah. And so the majority of people who come to Project Safe either come by referral or by calling the hotline or the text line. You can go to the next slide. And we have a ton of services and they're all listed here. And if you have any questions about them, you can ask me or Stephanie or William. A few that I want to highlight are the hotline and the text line. These are 24/7. You can always reach us. The hotline number is at the bottom of the screen, and I believe the hotline number and the text line number are going to be at the bottom of the screen on every single slide. So if at any point you need to jot those down or you need to text in or anything, that is totally fine. We are here 24/7 if you have questions or concerns. And so we also have an emergency shelter. And so this is a confidential shelter for people who are needing shelter. And then other things we have. So what we're going to be talking about today is court accompaniment and filing protective orders. So William will get into that in a little bit, and you can go into the next slide. And so, yeah, so we're going to get into our content for today, which is asking for a friend. And today's topic is what is stalking and how do I handle it? And really the idea behind this presentation series is just to create an area where we can have a conversation and talk about issues that are common and things that we deal with at Project Safe. And we just want to create a really just comfortable environment where we can ask questions and really just have safe discussions about these things. So we're going to start out with a poll, but before that, I want to mention that if you'll go to the next slide, there are things in this presentation that could be hard to hear or triggering. And so if at any point you want to turn off your camera or step away or message one of us or talk to Stephanie or William after the presentation, we just want you to know you have the freedom to do so. So please take care of yourself during this if there is something that comes up that is hard. And if you go to the next slide, you'll also see that we have a little QR code on the bottom of each page where you can send in anonymous questions. Stephanie and I will be monitoring that. And also if you want to ask the question, and you can do that in the chat. But if you want to do it anonymously, the QR code will be found at the bottom of every slide. So we're going to go ahead and start with the poll just about some statistics surrounding stalking. So it should be popping up on all of your screens.
How many women in the U.S. have experienced stalking in their lifetime? How many men in the U.S. have experienced stalking in their lifetime? What age range experiences the highest rates of stalking? True or false? Nearly every 3 out of 4 victims know their stalkers in some capacity. What is the most common relationship between the victim and the perpetrator?
Go over some of these stats before William gets into the discussion on everything. That first one is 100% correct, that 1 in 6 women in the US have experienced some form of stalking in their lifetime. The next question, how many men have experienced some sort of stalking in their lifetime, is 1 in 19 men. For the next question, that is 100% correct. that 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rates of stalking. So those who are in and around the college age, whether or not they're in college, they are the ones experiencing the highest rates of stalking behaviors. And number 4, absolutely true, that 3 out of 4 victims do know their stalker in some capacity, which leads straight into question number 5, that the most common relationship between a victim of stalking and the person perpetrating that stalking is a current or former intimate partner. So thanks for taking that poll. We just kind of wanted to do that to add some interaction and just to kind of get a baseline for the presentation. So now that we've done the poll, William is going to get into more information about stalking and what to do if a friend is experiencing that, and then some of the services that Project Safe offers surrounding that.
Thank you, Tucker. So before I get into it, I do want to mention that in talking about stalking, starting with the definition, is that there's kind of 2 perspectives going on at once. And I'll try to be very clear when I'm talking about one or the other. But if there's any confusion, there are questions that Stephanie and Tucker are both monitoring. So please feel free to stop me at any time. Those 2 perspectives are the legal definition of stalking. So what is actually considered stalking under the law, which is of course relevant to making police reports or potentially getting protective orders, and the holistic social work view of stalking, which can be a lot more broad in scope. So typically, if it's more general or more broad, that's more how I, as an advocate, might be looking at stalking. And if it's a lot more specific or focusing on certain definitions or actions, then that is probably more related to the legal aspect of stalking. So if there's any questions, please feel free to ask. So starting with a little bit of both, it is defined by the federal government, and it is focusing on, for the legal side of things, that definition is focused on placing another individual under surveillance, as well as continued harassing, contact, or a lot of people understand stalking sort of in the this person is following you from place to place to place, but that is extended to acts that occur over social media, over the phone, or digitally. So obviously in 2021, digital stalking is quite a serious concern as well. Bringing that out more broadly, that can put someone in the fear of harm or death, as when someone is stalking is considered a pretty significant risk factor for escalating that behavior. So this could take the form of a fear of harm, injury, or death for themselves, a relative, or any third party. It's not at all uncommon. We try to make contact with the victim, but to reach out to friends and family of the victim to try and either get information about that person or to send messages through them. So when stalking is occurring, and we'll talk more about this later, it's very important to see just who all is involved, because it's not uncommon for someone else beyond the stalker and the person being stalked to be involved. So abusers who use stalking to terrorize and threaten create substantial emotional distress for their victims, family members, and whatever third parties may be involved. In the poll, Tucker mentioned that for the most part, it is that the stalker is someone that the victim knows. But the way they know that stalker can be a pretty wide range of relationships. It could be someone that you went on a date with once or spoke to once and don't have a committed relationship to in any way, all the way up to they could be married and have children together. So stalking can occur in any type of relationship, up to and including no relationship at all. So that is important to consider, that it's not just a certain type of relationship. So here I've gone through some of the different ways that stalking can take place, and whether it's someone talking to a friend or a social worker or considering making a police report, something along those lines. These are the things that we will usually ask about in order to get a sense of what kind of situation is going on, as well as starting the process of safety planning, since once you've identified what the primary concerns or how this person is being stalked, you have the first steps of being able to address those. So the kind of most basic rule of thumb that I think most people consider when they think of the word stalking, you have unwanted contact, and that's repeated calls, text, emails. That can also be someone, repeatedly showing up to home, place of employment, school, something like that. And this often continues past or regardless of whether the victim says that they don't want contact anymore. And that's sometimes some people aren't quite sure whether it meets the definition or not, especially if they're concerned about making a report. And it can be a helpful boundary once you explicitly said that you don't want contact and they continue to press that. That makes the case for stalking a lot clearer. Even things that may seem sweet on the surface, such as leaving unwanted gifts or leaving gifts, letters, flowers, something like that, while it certainly has the aesthetics of a romantic gesture, the key to any healthy relationship is a healthy boundary. And these actions are the repeated violations of that boundary. So even though it may seem cute or quirky or maybe even romantic on the surface, I know we've all seen who knows how many rom-coms where they repeatedly show up at this person's house to declare their love. And while those stories may have happy endings in Hollywood, in real life, that person is violating a boundary that the other person has set. And at the very least, that's unhealthy. And in the worst case, that can escalate into violence. Beyond that, if someone has access to someone's computer, phone, something like that, it's unfortunately pretty easy to be able to get GPS tracking data, and even outside of like whatever hacking or software, it's somewhat easy to even get it through social media. A lot of apps like Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, they either have like geocaching data that show where a picture was taken, or they have some kind of like map or find my phone style feature, that'll actually show the general, if not specific, location that someone is posting or using their app from. So it doesn't always require any kind of technical know-how or ability to hack. It doesn't always require spyware or anything like that, although those are certainly possible. Sometimes it's as simple as following them on social media. And in a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about how to address that in terms of safety planning. If there is more contact, sometimes that harassing contact will either be, especially if there's a formerly intimate relationship where they know each other, then a lot of times places like home, work, school, they can be unsafe since the abuser or stalker may know where that is. And as we mentioned earlier, where third parties, friends, family members might become involved, it's not uncommon for the stalker to threaten to either involve them or almost blackmail the person in some type of way regarding the personal details of their lives. So stalking, as with many other aspects of unhealthy relationships, toxic relationships, domestic violence, the impact of stalking can be hard for the victim to deal with. That could be a significant increase of mental health concerns. It can potentially lead to depression, sleeping problems, overall levels of mental and emotional well-being. A lot of that coming from both the trauma of an abusive relationship, but also the stress and anxiety that comes from, always looking over your shoulder, being concerned for your safety, and that ongoing safety planning that might need to take place. So 1 in 5 people who've experienced stalking have to change some element of their daily routine, whether it's driving a new way to work, having your hours changed. 1 in 6 people change their phone number. 1 in 7 people move out of fear of being stalked. And 1 in 8 employed victims are impacted at their jobs or even lose time at work. As we continue the dialogue about unhealthy relationships and specifically domestic violence, one of the cornerstones of an abusive relationship is that it revolves around control. And so most abusive behaviors are either about establishing control in a relationship or maintaining control in a relationship. And stalking is usually in reaction to, it's either a way to maintain control because you're able to see where that person is at all time, you're able to address exactly what they're doing, or it's a reaction to that loss of control. So they don't know what that person is up to or where they're going, especially if that relationship has formally ended already. And one of the things we talk about in talking about domestic violence is that one of the most dangerous time for a victim is when the relationship has ended. That's when we see those relationships escalate as an attempt to maintain and reestablish that control. So stalking is actually considered a pretty significant risk factor when talking about the safety of relationships, and is when you look at cases where there has been significant injury, if not going further, if not death. Stalking is pretty common, a pretty common correlation to that. So it's very important to address it. Certainly not wanting to fearmonger or make anyone feel anxious, but sometimes stalking is kind of seen as this lesser form of abuse, especially if it doesn't concern anything specifically physical, when it is just as serious and can in fact be a warning sign that things can get more serious. So when talking about stalking, it's either when we get hotline calls about people who are talking about relationships in general, but also specifically stalking, we either get calls from the victims themselves and what they can do, or from concerned friends, family members, community members, about what they can do to support that person. And we'll go through both. The first thing, if you believe that you are experiencing stalking, is taking those steps to assess your personal safety. As much as possible, if you know the person, getting a sense of what they might be capable of. And that can be based on your prior relationship. That can be based off relationships that they've had in the past. It can be based off of if they have any kind of criminal history. Getting an idea of if and how their behavior might escalate from there. Once you've gotten that, it starts with creating a safety plan. So one of the ways that Project Safe will usually communicate that is a way to communicate to trusted friends and family members if there's an emergency. Sometimes that can be something with a code word or by keeping one's phone on them at all time. But ways that if their stalker shows up to a location, if they believe their stalker is nearby or somehow getting information from them, and certainly if their stalker is escalating to either physically dangerous behavior or making those direct threats, then having a readily accessible way to contact law enforcement is especially important. For cases where that person is, where the stalker is maintaining contact or following the victim without with something that they may not necessarily have knowledge of. So, showing up at the victim's home when they didn't previously know where the victim lived, or showing up at their place of employment when the victim and the stalker never talked about where the victim worked. So finding out what information or how that information is actually getting to the stalker. Is there a mutual friend who doesn't know what's going on and is providing information out of good intentions? Is it, as we talked earlier about social media? So, has there been something recently posted that had a picture of their home and they were able to do a Google image search and find out where it was? Is your information on Facebook that just shows where you're currently employed? Social media is kind of often described as law enforcement's worst nightmare when it comes to stalking, because of just how much information can be leaked through social media very easily. And of course, you on the more complicated end of things, you do have looking at location services for phones. So turning off your location services if necessary, or having your car or home or computer checked out if there is potential for spyware or even a GPS in the car or something along those lines. That way, that information can be better controlled for the victim's safety. If it's safe, and that's going to always be the baseline. If it's safe, trying to obtain documentation or the evidence of stalking can be helpful, both if you have to make a police report in the future, or if you're filing for a protective order, where those things may not be necessary, they certainly do help those cases. So if safe, taking screenshots of text messages, especially if they're repeated contacts or threatening messages, keeping voicemails, if the same car, if it's driving by your house or work repeatedly, getting photo evidence of that, or even video. If there's a safe way to obtain that information, that can be helpful. When the person feels ready, and it can be tough to talk about stalking, it can be tough to talk about relationship health in general, especially if it's unhealthy relationships. That the victim of stalking can always reach out to available resources. Project Safe, as Tucker already mentioned, is available to talk about that. There are some other local resources that I believe Tucker included in this presentation as well. Or if you're not ready to make such a formal step as reaching out to Project Safe or even law enforcement, it can start with reaching out to trusted friends or family members. When you're talking with someone like Project Safe, they can help with this whole process. I know something like saying, make a safety plan, obtain documentation, figure out how information is leaking. That's all pretty intimidating, especially when you're already going through something as stressful as being stalked. So reaching out to someone like Project Safe can help decrease a lot of the barriers to this and make it a lot easier, especially because you've got someone with you who not only understands the situation, but their goal is to support you through this. So if you have questions about this, reaching out to an organization like Project Safe or whatever your local organization might be can help with all of the above. So I don't want to make it sound like you have to take singular responsibility all on your own for all of these things, as there are supportive services in place. Once you've talked with that person, whether it's a social worker, whether it's a friend, family member, whoever it might be, from there, deciding what steps you're comfortable taking. Sometimes that can go up to making a police report and potentially having a criminal case, or making or filing for a protective order through the civil process, Or some people choose not to do those things. They would prefer something a little more informal, like not necessarily informal, but they may decide that they don't believe that filing a police report will help their situation, and they want to focus on confidential shelter or moving to a new location, especially if it's history with someone that they've been with before who they know to be violent, and they would prefer to just be as safe as possible. So there's no one size fits all method to addressing your safety here. Each person knows their own situation best. And in most cases, working with someone who can help you with the decisions that you want to make rather than forcing a specific decision on you is typically going to make that process a little bit easier. If you are making those more formalized plans, like something like moving, police report, filing that order, it's really important to come up with potential backup plans. Even something like filing a civil order, as I mentioned earlier, there are specific legal definitions of stalking. So if your situation is still serious, there's a lot going on, but for whatever reason doesn't meet that specific legal definition, and therefore you can't get the order, then it is important to have a backup option just in place. Those services are there and they help a lot of people, but you do want to make sure that you're maintaining your safety in any eventuality. Okay, so focusing on the protective orders first, just for a little bit of information, for someone who might be experiencing stalking and is at least interested. It is a civil order obtained through the court, and that is to differentiate it from a criminal case. So in a police report, if you make a report for stalking and they arrest that individual and charge them with the act of stalking, that's going to be a criminal case where usually the standard of evidence is higher, and could come with some potential jail time, or probation or something along those lines. A civil order is sort of the same part of court that divorces come from. So it's a court order that states that this individual is not allowed to contact another individual. To cut down on all the kind of jargon, usually if you think of something like people think of restraining orders, that's essentially what it boils down to. It can be more complicated and it can go through more in-depth things, not just no contact, but that's ultimately what it boils down to. It's a court order saying that this person is restrained from being in contact or being near this other individual, which would not come with any jail time or any criminal charges unless they then broke that order or defied that order. So for people who may be considered concerned about jail time, a protective order can be a good alternative, since it does not come with a criminal charge unless the stalker takes further action. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, in regards to safely collecting evidence, a temporary protective order does not require either a police report or a criminal case, or even necessarily breadth of evidence to make a case for a protective order, but all of those things do help. If you are interested in filing protective order, it's ultimately going to boil down to whether or not the judge believes that a case has happened or that stalking has occurred. And anything you can do to help show that to the judge, whether it's screenshots of text messages, like I was saying, pictures of them making repeated trips by the home, voicemails, anything like that, those help the judge see that stalking has occurred. And to, again, just sort of show the difference, even if a judge has made the ruling that they don't believe that this case meets those requirements, that does not make you ineligible for Project Safe services or social services. because there is that difference between the very specific legal definition and the much broader holistic social work definition, and they kind of work hand in hand. So even if a protective order doesn't work out, I was saying having those backup plans with a social worker or someone you can trust is really important. Um, to be a little bit more specific, just in case anyone is listening to this and believes that this does apply to them and that they are potentially interested, there's a temporary protective order, which does require a domestic relationship. So people who are married, have children together, or live together, something along those lines, that would be under a temporary protective order, and that can also cover a wider range of incidences of domestic violence. If there is no domestic relationship and you've never lived together, you've never been married, you never had any children together, then there is something called a stalking order, and it is called stalking order specifically, where you can get that that restraining order aspect of things even without the domestic relationship. So just because you're not married, just because you're not living together, does not mean that you can't address the stalking. There is still a way to do that through a stalking order. Okay. And again, just in case someone is potentially interested listening in on this now or in the future, I wanted to go over the very basic process of what getting a protective order looks like. It starts with filling out paperwork, which again, your local social service agency, whether it's us or whatever county you might be in, can help you with this process. There's a local agency, just because I saw Christine in the chat, Family Justice Clinic can also potentially help with protective orders. I won't go into full detail because I don't want to accidentally say something against their own policy. But they're a local resource, as well as RSVP through UGA. But there are resources that can assist with the paperwork and filing for protective orders. But the basic process starts with informing the judge of the act of stalking, along with the fact that you are requesting that protective order. It can involve, this is not a full hearing yet. This is just a one-on-one conversation with the judge, letting them know that you are requesting a hearing. And if the judge grants a hearing, then a temporary order goes into effect, hopefully that day, once the stalker has been served the paperwork informing them that there's a hearing. And that's when the temporary order goes into effect. So ideally, once you submit that paperwork and the sheriff's office gives that paperwork to the stalker, then the protective element should already be in place, where that person is no longer allowed to contact you. And that temporary order is in effect for a few weeks until the final hearing, which is called the 30-day hearing, because it's supposed to be within 30 days. That is a full court hearing, as you're probably used to thinking of by seeing either on the news or TV show or whatever. And that's where the judge will hear testimony and evidence from both sides. So the other person, if they are the person accused of stalking, they do have the opportunity to share their side of things if they feel like that it is not appropriate. From the testimony and evidence on both sides, the judge will make a determination for an order. Usually lasts for about a year, although that can be a little bit different. And if there are concerns like approaching the end of that year, there are options to have it extended, even to being a permanent protective order. Okay, so Tucker talked about our Project Safe services very generally, but to go over what we specifically can help with for stalking, we do provide emotional support. That's the foundation of anyone we're working with. We want them to know that they've got someone on their side who understands what they're going through. and that we don't have any agenda outside of what they would like help with. So we're not here to give them a case plan. We're not here to tell them what to do. We're here to give them information and help them make those qualified decisions. In addition to that, helping with that safety planning process, your advocate can be part of the safety plan. Make sure that you are aware of whatever emergency options are available, and certainly helping to come up with the steps that you may need if you do have to make that emergency call, including to either law enforcement or our hotline. For someone who is potentially interested in either making a police report or filing for a protective order, those are things that we're absolutely happy to help with. We can help someone and be there as support as they make that police report, or we can help them file or do the paperwork for the protective order, help them file it, and provide emotional support as they go through that process. We also provide emotional support for people who have potentially already made that police report and are now going through the criminal case as a victim themselves. It can be very intimidating to go through the legal system in any capacity, and we want to be there available to help provide whatever support and strength we can for someone who might be experiencing that. More broadly, Project Safe does try to be involved with legislation that helps provide services to victims of stalking and domestic violence. One common example is what's called the boyfriend loophole. When I was talking about the domestic relationships earlier, and I covered living together, being married, or having children as being domestic relationships, what that leaves out is people who have been dating, maybe even for years, but never lived together. So the boyfriend loophole, however you feel about the name, basically leaves out a very important class of intimate relationships that aren't covered by that specific legal definition. So helping advocate for legislation to close loopholes like that, as well as expand what services might be available to victims, is something that we are passionate about. So if your friend, if you are that trusted friend that someone who's experiencing stalking reaches out to, there are an important couple of important things I wanted to go through that someone can do to help support that friend. Um, Abusive relationships in general, but also especially stalking, revolve around that control, as I was saying earlier, but also rely on isolation. It's a lot harder to maintain that control when that person has a strong support group and people they can rely on. So by helping be part of that support group or support network, you're helping them sort of dismantle that control. And that by itself, even if you're not able to help with some of the more concrete goals, as I'll go mention in a little bit, that is still really important. Because domestic violence thrives in silence, it thrives in darkness. And by helping shed that light and be aware of it, is the first step to breaking down those barriers. So being there just as emotional support, even if that's all you're able to do, is still extremely important. In providing that support, it is important to avoid victim blaming. It's a really common trap, oh, you shouldn't have led them on. Now that's why they're obsessed with you. We've all seen the narrative like, oh, she shouldn't have dressed like that. She shouldn't have enabled him. And all of that does is shift the responsibility from the person who's actually committing those acts to the person who is the victim. It doesn't matter what that victim might have done. It's never okay to commit an act of violence. It's never okay to be abusive or controlling to your partner. And so not only does it not help the situation, but it makes that person less likely to reach out in the future. And as I was saying earlier, that's how control thrives, is that person is afraid to reach out. In that same vein, focusing on empowerment, and as I described, the way that the advocates work is that we all we do is provide information and support that allows that individual to make an informed, qualified decision. So providing your viewpoint and your experience is vital, but ultimately allowing that your friend to take the reins of control back into their life and make those decisions for themselves is the next step of dismantling that control and fear. For people who are able to, learning about local resources is extremely helpful. Even it's as simple as knowing a hotline. Obviously, it may not be tenable to know every single place that exists somewhere, but helping someone on that first step is very helpful. Especially if someone's able to do it in person. It can be really difficult to make that first call because you feel uncomfortable, you're unsure. Some people might even feel embarrassed of the whole situation. So it can be harder to take that first step. But being there while they're making that call can make that process a lot easier if that's what they want. Some people would prefer to do that on their own. And so it's important to be supportive while they go through that process. If possible and if safe for you, being part of their safety or emergency plan is also very helpful. So taking the time to establish that code word to call 911 with them, or even providing a safe location for them to stay, um, helping them with transportation to make a police report, anything like that is incredibly helpful. As a lot of the barriers are something as simple as they don't have childcare for their kids while they go make a report or go to the court, or they don't have a vehicle to get to the courthouse or get to our office. So it doesn't always have to be part of the actual stalking case itself, but things that you can do to help lower whatever barriers they have to addressing the stalking is really important. Throughout all of this, confidentiality is always important, as you want to respect other people's right to privacy, right to choose who they share with. But it's doubly important when talking about domestic violence and especially stalking. Stalking, of course, being that this person is following someone, is surveilling them in some capacity, is collecting information about them in some way. So doing your part to, not tagging them in something on Facebook, not posting pictures, not giving out their number or hours or place of employment, anything like that. Those are all really important. And if you suspect that someone might be in an abusive relationship or experiencing stalking, doing so in a way that doesn't involve the potential abuser, so that they don't realize that this person is reaching out for help, is really important. As I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest times of risk for a victim of domestic violence is when the other person feels that that person is trying to leave or is breaking free from that control. And so maintaining their confidentiality is so not to tell the abuser that this person might be planning on leaving is incredibly important for their safety. And just in case I didn't mention it specifically, you do not have to be the specific victim to contact Project Safe. If you want to call us and ask questions about how you talk to someone about this, or if you have concerns about a friend or family member who may be experiencing abuse, and you would like to know what resources you can give them, we would still love to talk to you. So don't feel like you have to be the victim yourself to reach out. Okay.
Alrighty, so now we have time for Q&A, and we really want this to be just a space where you feel like you can ask whatever questions you have. And again, if you scan that QR code, they will come to us anonymously through a Google form. You can unmute yourself and ask, or you can ask in the chat. There are a few questions in the form, but I want to open it up to people who want to ask questions right now. So if anyone has a question, feel free, and then we'll go to the anonymous ones.
Especially because I know I sometimes tend to ramble. So if there's anything I said that wasn't quite clear, or can provide more information about, I'd be more than happy to.
Okay, feel free to raise hand or pop a question in there. William, I'm gonna direct these at you. Oh, there's a question in the chat. So if you want to answer, and then we'll go from the chat to the Google form. So the first question is, do you happen to know if there are any fees associated with protective orders?
Not with filing the orders specifically. The only fees that would come out is if you hired an attorney privately. I mentioned the Family Justice Clinic earlier. If they are able to help with your situation, there may not be fees associated with that either. But there aren't any fees with actually just filing the order.
Okay.
And
so,
Project Safe services are completely free as well.
So a question in the Google form is, how do I learn about social media privacy settings so my info is private?
Sure. I'm not sure if, Stephanie, do you happen to know if we have any specific resources to give out on that?
I don't know about specific resources, but I do know Facebook has like a pretty thorough help guide. And if you go to Facebook's help page, there's an outline of what privacy settings there are and how to change them on your page.
Gotcha.
Thank you. So another question in the chat is, what would you do, or what can you do if someone is experiencing stalking and like the way the question reads, I think, is that they're believing they're experiencing stalking, but the people they're telling in their life are not taking it seriously. What would, I guess, the next best steps be for that person?
From the perspective of the person, the victim, or someone who's helping?
To clarify, if the victim thinks that they are experiencing stalking, but they're telling people and they're not really responding well, what would you suggest that person is in? Like, who should they reach out to next?
Gotcha. It is dependent on what that person is most comfortable with. As I was mentioning earlier with that kind of backup plan, that's exactly why I mentioned it. Because ideally, your friends and family are supportive. Ideally, law enforcement are responsive to your report. Ideally, if stalking is occurring, you're able to get a protective order. That I really would recommend getting in touch with an agency like Project Safe, or wherever you might be the local agency for your area. Since our philosophy is that we start with believing the individual. And not only is it our jobs, but we also know just how serious stalking is. That's the unfortunate kind of perception, is that, like I was saying earlier, stalking is somehow less serious, or sometimes that behavior is even seen as romantic. And so that is an unfortunate reality, and not at all uncommon. So if you feel like the people around you are not listening, I would hate for anyone to experience that, but it does happen. So reaching out to someone who is, again, that sort of non-biased isn't the exact word I'm looking for, but doesn't have any like specifically binding protocols. So we do not have to necessarily go by the specific legal definition of stalking. So if you take a case to the courthouse and it doesn't meet those requirements, that can be very understandably disheartening to experience, and would potentially feel incredibly invalidating to how you see yourself going through this act of stalking. So someone who is able to assist you and able to validate that even outside of the societal perception, outside of the legal perception, whatever that might be, I think is personally very helpful.
Okay, awesome. And there's one more question that popped up in the chat. But first, I just want to mention that Christine did link a really awesome resource for tech safety. And I think that we'll try to copy that over and kind of share it, send out a blast on our social media too, so that anyone could get in touch with that tech safety
That's
resource.
awesome. Thanks, Christine.
And then, yeah, thank you so much. And then we're going to do one more question just for the sake of time. And so the question says, any specific feedback for helping men seek out resources in overcoming the reluctance to ask for assistance or help? And have you encountered men who have perceived that they were not taken seriously by the court system?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great question. And a lot of the narrative when we talk about domestic violence, or we talk about abusive relationships, one of the kind of terms that pops up very often is discussing the patriarchy and how a lot of violence is perpetrated by males against people who are female, and that's, I think, the narrative that most people think of. And the irony is that that narrative also hurts men, because when the message is focused on men as abusers, the idea of a man as a victim almost becomes comical. And so you're absolutely right. I think there are a lot of situations where men who are victims of stalking feel uncomfortable reaching out, either because they feel like nothing will come of it, but they might also be perceived as weak or unable to stand up for themselves, or even the fear that it might get turned around and they may look like they're potentially the abuser in this case. The 1 in 19 statistics that Tucker mentioned, one important thing to note is that these are individuals who have reported stalking. So chances are it's probably more than that. So specific guidance I would recommend, I know it's obviously, I'm very biased, but reaching out to someone like Project Safe I think is important, because we take a very broad view of domestic violence and recognize that it does happen to people regardless of whatever their gender might be, and that controlling behaviors and abusive behaviors, especially once you stretch them past that legal definition, the rates of who experiences it tend to even out. So men being victims definitely picks up. I'm just pulling up the chat so I can answer your question specifically. I did say I go on tangents. Specific feedback, I would say, being aware and finding resources, and certainly we would love to be that resource, or help you look for the resource that's best for you, that discusses, perception of masculinity, I think is really important. Like I mentioned earlier, that kind of toxic masculine view that to be a man, you always have to fight and stand up for yourself, even to the point of physical violence, when often that can either escalate the situation or even put you at risk of being arrested yourself, and also not where your value comes from. So, not being able to handle that does not have any saying on your sense of masculinity or what that might be. And law enforcement is at a point now where if there is an alleged act of family violence, they are required to act on it. So there may be an element of feeling like they're not being taken seriously, and that tends to happen across the board, regardless of gender. But if there's if the law enforcement feels like there is evidence of stalking or family violence in any capacity, they are required by law to address it. So that could be something that could make one feel more comfortable in making that report.
Okay, sweet. Thank you so much, William. And I'm sorry that we are out of time. But I just want to thank everyone for attending, for asking great questions, and for just being present to talk more about this. Because again, that's what we want this series to be, is a time to just kind of have a low stakes environment to ask weird and hard questions that we want answers to. And I really want to thank William for using all of your expertise about this. I really enjoy learning from you. So I appreciate you being here today and talking about all of this. And as we wrap up, again, please reach out to us in any capacity. Here's a bunch of ways to reach us. We also have social media. And then, William, if you'll go to the next slide, to highlight RSVP. That is a UGA resource, very similar to Project Safe. But if you are a UGA student or no UGA student and just wanted an alternative, RSVP is very happy to help and offer services or just to chat. And they're super great. And we're very happy to be involved in this presentation by us relaying their information to you guys. So thank you, everybody. And we're going to be doing this every month. So look on our social media for updates on all of this. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.